what was the moment, the issue that you were glad got covered last night?
There are a few things. I think that going into the hypocrisy of a neocon establishment that wants to send your sons and daughters to go fight in somebody else's war, the fact that many of those proponents, from Chris Christie to Nikki Haley, apparently don't know the first thing about those wars that they want you to fight for. What provinces of Ukraine are we even going head over heels to go after?
So what was it? Were you ready for that province question? I was wondering afterwards, just as a political geek. I was like, okay, was that something? I looked at it as the goal was to say, you're the foreign policy expert, Nikki Haley.
Yep.
Tell me 3 provinces. Did you go into the debate with that, or was that something you thought of on the fly?
I thought of it on the fly, actually, because it occurred to me, you could see she was a little bit off kilter. She's somebody who actually 2 debates ago said that she feels dumber every time I speak.
Right.
And so I thought of actually going after her a little bit for that, but I thought, let's think literally. I understand why she feels dumber when I speak. So let's just put this on the stage.
Okay.
Because her knowledge is totally missing. And it's not just her. It's an intellectually bankrupt philosophy where the people who want to send you to give taxpayer money and send our sons and daughters to those foreign wars, the ultimate farce at the end of it is they don't even know the first thing about those wars.
Right.
That's really what the actual farce that the whole thing is all about. Yeah.
One of our Alabama, I'm sure he was just getting back from the debate. Yeah. What did you expect her to say? Did you think she wasn't going to know those provinces? Or did you just think,
I mean, that's one example.
If she had spatted it out, would that have been a surprise to you?
I would have been surprised.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have been, I mean, it wasn't just that. It's the fact that these people have a total absence of real foreign policy vision or grounding in history or understanding of really even, I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't know how many more presidents in U.S. history she would have named when asked about the U.S. presidents she admires as well. What I've learned is I've gotten to know these people in depth. They are practiced puppets reciting political slogans handed to them. I mean, you've lived in that world.
Yeah.
You know what these traditional politicians are like. I didn't expect this coming in as a newcomer to this process. These aren't people with actual views. They're just reciters of slogans. And I think the public deserves to see that the people who are the most bloodthirsty advocates of continuing this war in Ukraine don't even know the first thing about it.
So let me ask you
one example. There's some other things I think we accomplished last night as well.
One of the things in debates, there was always an old school tactic was, tell me how much a gallon of milk costs. The idea is you want to see if someone's relatable, that they've been in a supermarket. Tactically speaking, I think that was the foreign policy equivalent of that. Okay, Nikki Haley, name 3 provinces since you cite your foreign policy.
But it's one step more than that, though. It's somebody who is touting their own foreign policy experience. So it's like the gallon of milk would be if somebody says they're an expert in milk cartons, and then they're an expert in knowing what the winner from The Price is Right, and that's my qualification to run the economy. That'd be a pretty bizarre basis to run for president. But if it was, it would be especially damning if you did not know how much a carton of eggs cost or how much a gallon of milk costs.
So
so it's that backdrop, somebody who's been touting her foreign policy credentials as her prime basis for running for U.S. president, and also favoring these foreign wars that I believe haven't advanced our American interests, revealing herself, I think, in so many fronts, not to know the first thing of what the hell she's talking about, I think is one of the many farces of a bipartisan establishment. I said it wasn't just true of Nikki Haley.
Right.
It's true of Joe Biden. I said that on the stage, too. It's a bipartisan foreign policy establishment that doesn't know the first thing about what they're advancing. But I also took the time on stage not just to talk about the other candidates. I think there are certain unspeakable realities that the media won't really feed you, but is an absolute hard truth now based on evidence that we have from January 6th to the realities of what a Democratic Party immigration policy is really all about in their own words. These are things that the media said you can't speak.
Do you think you spend enough time? The thing that continues to amaze me in these debates is how much time. Look, I am a Republican through and through. You would make a much better president than Joe Biden, Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis. Hell, that guy that just got escorted by us would probably make a better president than
the
Joe
average
Biden.
person off the street certainly would.
But I cringe sometimes on the amount of red on red that we do to each other versus
debates.
I get it. But my point last night was that I sat around watching what happened the other day on Capitol Hill with these Harvard presidents. I look at what's happening in Ukraine, in China, all over the world, domestically, here at our border with the number of Chinese migrants, military-aged men lined up. And I'm going, are we spending enough time prosecuting the case against Joe Biden during these debates? What's the mix?
Well, I would say that's up to the moderators, and I also
it's also up to you.
But I also think, from my vantage point, it's about drawing a contrast with other candidates. This was what this primary process is about. After that, you're going to go after Biden. But I think that there's a deep ideological divide in the GOP that we can't just paper over. I think that there are greater similarities between Joe Biden's foreign policy and Nikki Haley's and Chris Christie's foreign policy than there is between mine and Donald Trump's policy, right? So I think that that's Donald Trump and I have similar foreign policy. Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, and Joe Biden have similar foreign policy. But just because we're running the Republican Party doesn't mean that we're the same on how to deal with this war in Ukraine. So I think some of these ideological divides, Sean, go deeper than just partisan ones. I'll give you another example, is on free speech.
Okay.
I think that there is a pro-censorship movement within the Republican Party. Take a look at Nikki Haley's own policy to say that every American, if they're using a social media profile, if they're using social media, has to have government-issued ID tied to that profile. Jack Smith, and I've criticized Jack Smith for this, under Biden, in the Trump case subpoenas from 2020, has subpoenaed any American who dared to like or retweet a post from Donald Trump. That's authoritarian. But the only thing more authoritarian than that is saying that each of those users should have had government-issued ID tied to their social media profile. That's Orwellian. That's fascist in the United States. So I don't care if you call yourself a Republican. That's not red on red. That's authoritarianism versus freedom.
So let me get back to foreign policy. One last question on this, because I thought what was interesting about your comments last night were how you want to approach Ukraine, right? Here's why we don't need to be involved in Ukraine, right? You made a very interesting case there. But then you were the only candidate that said that if Taiwan was attacked by China, it's in our strategic interest to defend it. Why? What
for the foreseeable future, yeah.
Explain the juxtaposition there.
Well, one hard answer that's just a quick answer I can give you is that we depend on Taiwan for a modern way of life. And if people don't know that right now, they should.
But you could make the case that in Ukraine.
No, I
get
to
it.
be very specific.
Okay.
People understand. You probably know this, Sean, but so that anybody who's listening to this really understands what I mean. That's not metaphorical. The little semiconductor chips that power our phones, that power those lights over there, the refrigerators in that restaurant, those cars we're looking at, literally our modern way of life depends on Taiwan for our modern way of life. And if China has an economic gun to our head to say that our entire modern way of living, we'd be third world nation without access to those leading edge semiconductors from Taiwan. That is a major problem for the United States of America. And there's no similar case even close to be made for Ukraine. That's a good starting answer. And we could go much deeper than that, but that's a big difference between the two.
But I can argue, I mean, U.S. policy right now is strategic ambivalence, right? So that the second, what you said right now, just if from a foreign policy standpoint, is provocative towards China, right?
I've provided what I call strategic clarity instead of strategic ambiguity. Right. And I do think that strategic clarity is how we stay out of World War III. History teaches us that world wars start not because nations want to enter them, but because they accidentally trip red lines when everybody was vague about where they stood. I think we're closer to World War III than we've ever been in my lifetime.
Look,
so I think that moving to strategic clarity is important. So what I've said is at least for the foreseeable future, until we've achieved semiconductor independence or otherwise, we will defend Taiwan. And then after that, we can resume strategic ambiguity, which is the status quo. And so, yes, I think it's going to take somebody with an actual vision for our foreign policy. Part of that ending of the war in Ukraine is, I've also said I would use that to weaken the Russia-China alliance, pull Russia out of its military alliance with China. The Russia-China military alliance is the single greatest threat that we face. That would be one of my requirements with Putin to end that Ukraine war on mutually agreeable terms, is that we weaken, if not end, that Russia-China alliance. So this is what we need in our foreign policy, is actual vision. And this goes back to the debate last night. Because for the entire debate, from the Mike Pences to the Chris Christies to the Nikki Haley's to much of the left-wing mainstream media, they've derided me compared to those candidates for the lack of foreign policy experience. And I think we proved on that stage last night definitively that foreign policy experience is not the same as foreign policy wisdom.
Right.
If anything, our history teaches us for the last 25 years that actually those with self-professed foreign policy experience are the ones with the absence of the real wisdom. Donald Trump, in that sense, I mean, he's the president who kept us out of major wars and grew the economy. He was an outsider that came in without that alleged foreign policy experience either. And I applaud him for that. But I'm now the leader from the next generation. Now I'm the outsider in this race. And I think it's going to take an outsider with fresh legs to take that America First movement to the next level. And I think that the farce of that neocon establishment was really exposed as the emperor who has no clothes on that stage last night.
So foreign policy obviously dominated a lot of the talk last night. Iowa is the first state, 40 delegates at stake. I think a lot politically at stake for these campaigns. We've talked about that in the past. How much do you think the voters of Iowa, the roughly 200,000 people that are going to go caucus, care about foreign policy as an issue that they're deciding you versus Nikki Haley versus Ron DeSantis versus Donald Trump?
I think they care about the United States of America and making sure that we're actually protecting our homeland.
Yeah.
And so in some case, the fact that we're talking about
you're
these
everywhere.
wars,
You're everywhere in Iowa. When I talk to people, they'll say that guy does more events than I've seen anyone do. But how much does that come up?
I think
or do you bring it up?
No. I think it comes up a decent amount. But I don't think people care about the exact individual details of this particular thing in Armenia versus Ukraine versus knowing that we're going to have a president who's going to prioritize keeping Americans safe here at home. And when I tell them we would sooner use our own military to secure our own border than somebody else's border halfway around the world, that gets rousing applause every time.
Yeah.
I think a lot of issues that Iowans care about are being ignored as well. I mean, I've met Iowa farmers, and I mentioned this in my closing statement last night, who are about to have their land taken by eminent domain to run a carbon capture pipeline in favor of a new global climate change cult that, frankly, the Republican Party has been too meek on. So I think I'm the only candidate taking on issues like that one. But I think people also care about basically understanding that you have a president who's going to downsize the federal government to meet our national debt issues so the next generation isn't loaded with $34 trillion in national debt, that you're going to have a president who grows the economy. The rising inflation, rising interest rates combined with stagnant wages, that's what's really leaving people hurting. It's time for a CEO in the White House. And I think that I'm the only person on that stage last night, certainly, who's been a CEO, who understands deeply how the economy functions and how to grow this economy. And also somebody, I think people are hungry for that new generation with fresh legs to lead us forward. That doesn't just mean being young. I think Ron DeSantis tried to bring that up as a contrast with Trump. I think you can be older in years and younger in spirit. I think Trump and I are the two America First candidates in this race. That is the future of the Republican Party, rather than chasing the Dick Cheney philosophy of the past. But I do think that it does help as well to be somebody who has not only fresh ideas, but fresh legs to go along with it. That's the combination I'm bringing.